She looks significant. Anyway, hello, good evening, and welcome. Welcome to the Institute for Government. This is one of a number of seminars we've been having under the general title Cutting Edge Policy, when we invite people with interesting and different approaches to the way in which we make policy to come and talk. And we're absolutely delighted this evening that we've got Paul Ormerod, who the response to this seminar has been so fantastic that I should say you need no introduction. But anyway, Paul, despite that I will introduce him. Paul is director at Synthesis IPS and a partner in Volterra, but most of you will know him from his various books he's written, including The Death of Economics in 1994, which didn't stop him from going on to write Butterfly Economics in 1998, and the rather depressingly entitled Why Most Things Fail in 2005, which maybe recently won the Business Week US Business Book of the Year. He's going to talk to us for about 25 minutes about networks and public policy. It's quite interesting, those of you who are at the Behaviour Change Forum that we had at the end of July, where we're very much focusing on behaviours of individuals. I think it's very interesting to look at how that changes when you put it into a network context. We're then going to have two quite brief responses. First of all, from my erstwhile colleague, Mike Halsworth, who should be known to all of you as the author of the IFG's fantastic, excellent report, System Stewardship. For those of you that haven't caught up with that yet, there are copies of the executive summary available outside, but I would recommend you join the almost 2,000 people who've already downloaded it from our website. It's just to embarrass Mike. So Mike is going to give a short response and link this into that piece of IFG work. And then we have, lurking at the end, but standing out in red, Bridget Rosewall, who is notable for being Chief Economic Advisor to the Mayor of London. So she's going to take some of what Paul says and apply it in that real-life context. So that will take about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we're going to, as always, open up for general questions, discussion with the panel, challenge, etc., etc., etc. So without further ado, and making an unprecedented early start, I think, for an IFG event at only T+5, I'd like to hand over to Paul Ormerod.
Well, thanks very much, Jill. I have to say, it's a more effusive introduction than when I spoke at a government department a few months ago. The chief economist introduced me and said, we're very pleased to have Paul here tonight. When he wrote The Death of Economics, we all thought he was completely mad. But now, and then he sat down. So, but anyway, well, you know, the IFG is a very serious outfit, so what I want to start off with just a definition so people know for certain what I'm talking about when we're talking about networks, because it means different things to different people. So what do we mean by networks, and in particular social networks? Now, the first thing that springs to mind is, of course, online networks. That's in everybody's mind, and of course it can mean that. That is a form of network. When you're actually on the internet and searching around or looking at things that are trending in different boxes, you are connected to a network. So when you Google something and the Google search, the sites come up, there's a network lying behind that of the previous people who've connected to that site. And Google's got different algorithms for linking these things, which you know, whether they come up 1, 2, 3, or 10,000 or whatever. So when you do that, there is a network there, and there's networks on Facebook and networks on Twitter. But in fact, it is much more general concept. And that's mainly what I'm talking about tonight. We're talking about real-world networks, if you like, of friends, families, colleagues, interest groups. What make up, if you like, civic society? These are the networks which are important in the spread of ideas and of behaviour. So that's what I'm principally talking about, is the real-world networks. We've all got them. Who do we listen to? Who do we pay attention to? Who do we try and influence? That's what I'm talking about tonight. But I want to give an example, first of all, of a network effect where we had unintended consequences of incentives. I'm going to step back in time about 20 years, because soccer hooliganism was a big problem. Some of you may, well, looking around the room, some of you may remember that period. And it was, the World Cup was being played in Italy. And people were terrified about what the English fans might do. So the wheeze was to play all England's games in Sardinia. So at least they might be confined. And there was a very heavy police presence, and by and large this seemed to work. But there's an excellent book by Bill Burford called On the Thugs, when he followed thugs around for a period of time. It's a very deep book, but it's also a very funny book. So there, one evening in Cagliari, it's a really hot evening, and the word goes around the fans, right, they're going to have a riot, they want to have a riot, so they meet in the central square at 6 o'clock. And there they are, thousands of them, desperate for a riot. So in standard economic terms, they're going to derive utility, they're going to get benefits from trashing the town and beating people up. That's why they're there, right? They're going to get benefits from it, utility. It's a very broad definition, right? But why don't they do it? Because there are costs. Because in facing them are a huge row of police, in full body armour, helmets, truncheons, shields, and revolvers. And they're thinking, well, maybe the costs, are a bit too high. And they're all standing, it's a bit of a standoff. And one or two mad individuals try and incite the crowd, incite the fans. They rush forward, the police truncheon them to the ground, beat them to a pulp. And they think, maybe not, maybe not. And there they are. And the Italians are getting fed up with this. And so a police captain then thought he'll give them incentive to disperse. There they are, arms to the teeth, and he gets his revolver out and fires it into the air. And the discharge of live ammunition was a signal for the fans to riot, to immediately attack the police and destroy property. So it was you think, if somebody's going to shoot at you with live ammunition, well, you obviously charge them. And so there was an incentive. He was using a standard incentive. It wasn't a monetary price, but it was a price, a cost. He was raising the cost of rioting, and that was a signal to riot. Because what happened was, if you think about it, they were a collection of individuals with their preferences and weighing up the costs and benefits. And then suddenly the network, the idea of having a riot spread across the whole crowd, the whole set. They were no longer acting as individuals, but the idea of crowd behaviour, of being influenced by other people on that network, that was a network of fans, it suddenly spread like wildfire across the network and overwhelmed the incentives. The network effect overwhelmed the incentives, and there was a massive riot in Cagliari. So the incentive was not to riot, and yet one or two individuals said they would, and it spread across the network. So there's an example of how networks can overwhelm standard incentive effects. Because thinking about incentives, I want now to try and summarise, if you like, economic and social policy since 1945 in a single slide. But basically what we have is it's based on the view, whether it's social policy or economic policy, it's based on the view that decisions are made reasonably rationally by people, firms, planners, and I'm an economist, so I'm going to call them agents, decision makers, whether they're individuals, whether they're institutions. They're made reasonably rationally, and the basis for policy is incentives. That agents respond to incentives is true. It's the only general law in the whole of social science. Agents respond to incentives. And incentives, in turn, are mainly, in this view of the world, based upon price, some aspects of price. Let me just give a few examples. So, if we're thinking about people on benefit, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, if we want to try and get them into work, a standard response might be to say, well, let's actually reduce the level of benefits relative to wages. So there's still a big debate, for example, about the interwar period, about the relative role of benefits relative to wages in the high unemployment of the interwar period. It's not completely resolved yet, but the idea was if we actually reduce benefits, make it less attractive to be unemployed, more attractive to work, we'll switch people, we'll give people incentives to move into work. Think about energy and consumption. Well, we raise the price. That's a current theme in government policy. You want people to use less energy, you put the price up, and that's the standard way. If you're in Ireland and you want to attract firms into your country, you reduce corporation tax. And to some extent that works. Interest rates, well, I'll pass on that because even after 40 years of studying economics, I don't know what the effects of interest rates are. But you can see that there's some sort of incentive mechanism at work in various ways. So these are the standard ways in which we think about policy. We price fairly broadly defined, and we try to act on that, to alter that, to change the set of incentives that people face, and we believe that will change their behaviour, alter their behaviour in ways we can understand and bring about desired aims. It's a very mechanistic view of the world, and let's face it, it has had some success. It's not been completely without successes, but it's very limited in what it can actually achieve. Because here we are in 2011, over 60 years after the founding of the welfare state, and the vision, the original vision of the big society after the Second World War, not just in Britain but across the West, was that a much bigger state could help to solve our social and economic problems. Because even in America, when we look at the size of the state in the economy, it's much bigger in the decades after the Second World War than it had ever been, except, of course, in wartime itself. And yet we still have many, many problems. So I think that's a basic idea underlying economic and social policy for a long time. Now, along comes nudge, very fashionable. And essentially what this is doing is to say it's a smarter and broader way of thinking about incentives. The incentives I've spoken about so far are essentially price related. We're talking about benefits, we're talking about corporation tax, we're talking about putting up taxes on energy consumption, we're talking about price. It's broadened the dimension of what constitutes an incentive to try and think of smarter ways. So, the standard one that I'm sure most people know, which actually was operated in some urinal in the Netherlands to stop splashes for half the audience who don't understand what goes on in these things. And so people painted a fly on the wall so people would aim at it and reduce, and it seemed to work. So that was an incentive. We won't go into the psychology of what that incentive was. It was an incentive, and it seemed to work. So there's nudge. It's broadening the idea of incentives. It's broadening the idea. So that's how we should think of nudge. It's actually still in the same framework of the idea of agents, decision makers, mainly individuals, but we could extend it to institutions, firms, deciding in isolation, as standard economic theory has us think. Here's a collection of individuals, they have tastes and preferences, they look at the set of incentives, and they weigh up the costs and benefits and make a decision on the basis of that. And nudge is really just broadening the idea of what constitutes a benefit or possibly what constitutes a cost. So it's an extension. It extends the range of the policies available to policymakers. Now, networks are quite different. There's recognizing that agents can be influenced not indirectly by, see, if I take an action, it affects the price of something. If I buy something and the price goes up, then everybody else who wants to buy that is affected because the price is going up. It may deter some people, but that's indirectly through the market mechanism. I'm influencing other people's behavior, but my decision is only indirectly impacting on somebody else. But the idea of a network is that if I take a decision, somebody's preferences will change. They're not just simply responding with a fixed set of ideas about what they like and what they don't like. It changes what they like. And we're all, well, certainly those of us in the private sector do this, because when we're playing the internet, some of us actually irresponsibly, just tick, when a box comes up saying these items are trending now, some of us had the time to spare to click those rather than do our job. And so we look and see, I looked the other day, one about a giant crocodile that had been captured. Now, some of you may have seen it, but I wasn't intending to go on the web looking for a story about a giant crocodile. It was a bit disappointing, really, but I was interested, I was intrigued. And lying behind that statement on the site was a network. Again, it was a network of people who previously clicked on that. It was a very temporary network, and then tomorrow it would be replaced by another network of people who were looking at who made stories popular. But that was a network, and my preferences were altered. I'd previously no interest in giant crocodiles, but it looked intriguing. It gave me an interest. It changed my preferences. Now, you think that's a trivial example. I'll come on to more serious ones of how agents can be influenced directly. So there's a wide variety of behavioural motives for this, and I'd be happy to discuss it in questioning, but there's a very strong basis in psychology of a whole range of aspects of why people might be influenced directly by what other people do. Or thinking just more generally, if you're looking, say, for financial advice as an individual, there might be a few individuals whose views you trust. You might read a journalist whose views you've come to respect, or it might be an uncle or a friend who, over the time, you've formed a view that they have good judgment on financial matters. 2 or 3 people. So that's your network in that particular case. You'll be influenced. You've got lots of information about financial products, financial service companies, but you might be influenced directly by what other people have done. They'll say, well, I choose, let's say, Barclays or whatever, and so you do the same because somebody who you respect has made that same decision. So let's just call it copying for shorthand, but there's a variety of psychologically based reasons for this. So network effects alter the tastes and preferences and values of agents, and that's what the big society seems to me to be about, to try to change values. I'm going to come back to some examples of this. So there are good things and bad things about networks. So they can magnify, in terms of good things, start off first, they can clearly magnify the effect of any initial change caused by an incentive or a nudge. So if we manage to persuade a few people, if we say put the price of energy up, and some people stop using energy, and if people might just copy it, it becomes fashionable. Or thinking about recycling in a street. There's lots of evidence to suggest that if you can persuade a critical number of people to participate in a scheme, then suddenly you find that almost everybody in the street's doing the same, whereas nobody was. If you give 2 or 3 start to do it, they'll just be regarded as eccentric, and they're not copied. There's not sufficient momentum, there's not sufficient critical mass to be copied. But if enough people do it, there will be, even if people don't speak to each other, like we all live in London streets, so we know the feeling, and nobody's speaking, we don't know your neighbours possibly, but you see them leaving out there whatever it is, and you say, well, maybe I should do that, and you do. Whereas you didn't before, you're no interest in doing that, you see other people doing it, and you're persuaded to do it. So it can magnify the effect of any initial change caused by incentives on it. Importantly, and I've got a slide in a minute to hopefully try to illustrate this more graphically, it extends the range of options available to policy makers. Because, and again, I'm happy to deal with this in questions, different types of network structure that we observe in the real world are differently susceptible. They have different pressure points, different critical masses, to the idea of the percolation of different sets of ideas, different types of values. There are different ways in which we can intervene more or less successfully. So network structure matters, but also that information extends the range of abilities of policymakers. But in addition, we may think about changing network structure. So there are more ranges of options, more imaginative things that policymakers can do. And I'll give a couple of examples of this in a minute. But against that, on the negative side, as we've seen with the police captain firing his shot in the air, it can offset the effect of any initial change caused by incentives or nudge. If the different idea spreads across the network, incentive effects can be overwhelmed. But it also increases the uncertainty of any change in policy. Let me just try and summarize. This is a stylized representation of a sort of network which is frequently found in the real world. Its technical term is a small world, but we could think of it as overlapping friends of friends. So, I mean, these actually are people. I could have drawn heads, but I couldn't. I mean, I'm an economist after all, so these are abstract representations of people. And these are who they're connected to. These who they're, in this particular case, this person, let's say this person here, is connected. These are the people who potentially, doesn't mean they will do, when this person's making a decision about buying something or about adopting a particular mode of behaviour or deciding a set of values, deciding how to vote in an election or whatever, this person looks at these 3 people. And so these links show how the people are connected. And you can see what we mean by overlapping friends of friends. I mean, it's widely found in the real world. So traditional policy is based on the idea that these operate in complete isolation. We could remove all these connections, and here we have just a series of blue dots. And not just that, but their tastes and preferences are fixed. They don't evolve, they don't alter. And so we use incentives to try and alter behavior of isolated individuals. Now, in a network structure, this person will be affected. What their beliefs are, what their values are, will be affected by these. So they could be if you like, they will evolve over time. They could be influenced. So if we can influence this person, we may also get that for free, and this one for free, and that one for free. We may not. Depends how it spreads. But notice there are also in these things some long-range connectors in this sort of network. It's not just very densely knit friends of friends. So as a practical example, say, a long-range connector will be somebody who is a member of a running club, but also a stamp collecting club, sort of sedentary hobby. There can't be many of those, but that would be a long-range connector in terms of interest groups. Somebody here connects the two, and that would be a way of spreading ideas. So if we can find, maybe a challenging task, in this sort of network, if we can find the long-range connectors and persuade them somehow to change their behavior, we could see how we could get it going around the network like wildfire. Or we may, if as a target of policy, try and change the structure, because this isn't given, this isn't fixed. We think of our own lives, of your friends and family and colleagues. It's not a fixed set, this evolves over time. The people you pay attention to may not be very rapid, but it changes. And if we can change these, if we can introduce more long-run connections or whatever. And this is just one example of a particular type of network. And try to bring home how radically different the idea of network-based policy is. It's not isolated individuals with fixed tastes and preferences. These change, and they change partly in response to what other people are doing. And secondly, we might want to remove some connections if we don't want ideas to spread. So for example, think of the London riots. And one thing that we know in terms of whether a thing is going to take off is not the initial size of the impact. This is a very recent finding in social network theory. It's not the initial impact in a network, but if it occurs in quite a number of different places, even on a small scale, it's much more likely to go global across the network as a whole than if we have one big occurrence in just one part of the network. So think how rapidly that spread. It wasn't just confined to Tottenham. Quite quickly it was spreading around. And so it became a major issue. So we can think of contemporaneous policy in that way. I just want to give a quick example of it's an experiment, but it's very an interesting one, to show the impact that networks can have on outcomes. For those of you who want, there's the academic article published in Science, a top journal. And essentially, they gathered together some students who were allowed, this was written 5 years ago, so what was done 6 years ago, they were allowed to download previously unknown songs, either with or without the knowledge of previous participants' choices. And they were all, it wasn't so arias from Götterdämmerung, it was some genre of music that students at the time liked. So they were likely to want to download them. And there were 48 songs that come along, so a student goes in, under one set of experiments, you can listen to a snatch, and then you listen to whatever you want, and download whatever you want, and go away. And you've no idea what other people have chosen. In another set of experiments, it's exactly the same, but on the screen, before you decide to download, is a list, ranked from 1 to 48, of people's previous choices. So which is you know what the number one choice was of everybody else who chose before you when you made your choice. So that was the only difference. So the first one might thought of, it's a classic, if you like, the preferences of the agents. They don't know that they're acting in isolation. They go along and they reveal their preferences exactly as economists want them to do. They come along and say, yes, I like this, I don't like that, I don't like that. The other one, you give one bit of information, you say, okay, when I choose, I know what's number one, what's number two, what's number three. That's the only change. And here's a typical outcome of one of the experiments with no social influence. We might think this is the preferences. And I've set it so the average is 100, so to compare the two. Now, there was one song clearly that people didn't like. That wasn't very popular. But in general, the least popular one's got about 50 or 60 relative to an average of 100, and the most popular got 150 or 160. So that was, if you like, standard policy. That one bit of information, which is a network, don't forget, so it's a network. When I look at it and the screen says this song is number one, that's a network. I'm connected to people who chose that. I'm connected to people who chose number 2. I'm connected to people who chose number 3. I've got information about people's previous choices. The network's going to go away. It's temporary, but at the time, I know that network is potentially influencing me. And this is the outcome you get, typical outcome we get here. And notice the scale is completely different. That most get very little, and the successful get huge amounts. Now, this sort of distribution characterizes most popular culture markets. YouTube downloads, all sorts of things follow this sort of distribution. This sort of thing where a few get lots of hits or lots of attention, lots of choices, the tail gets very little. So my son, for a period, when he left Cambridge, wanted to be in the arts. So I was really pleased when he decided to become a management consultant, because he was going to likely end up here, despite his inherent abilities. Because one of the key point here is that the songs which came up top here, these are not the same as these in general. There's very little connection between the inherent qualities of the songs. So by and large, this one never came top. But in some of the experiments, songs down here came top because because of the network effect. It overwhelmed people's preferences. It made a huge difference. There was very little connection between what the students as individuals thought of the quality of the songs and what actually happened. So the ones which won, the ones which are coming up here, could have been almost anywhere in that distribution. It's had a dramatic impact on people's choices. So let me just move on and to conclusion. So think about worklessness. It's a big problem. We can find identical estates. I mean, they're all, from quite poor socioeconomic backgrounds. For socioeconomic purposes, equivalent. They're identical. Worklessness is high on all of them, but in some it will be, even say just a mile or two apart, it will be very much bigger than on others. 2 reasons network theory tells us 2 potential reasons. One of which is, if you like, the strength of the internal network, the culture, because as more and more people in a locality become unemployed or living on some form of benefits, then it's the culture, it's a local norm to do that. And it's much easier for somebody who was trying to adhere to the culture of going to work to say, oh, why should I bother? Because all my neighbours don't. They can get benefits and this little scam you can do, this, that and the other. I can be just as well off. I won't bother going to work either. So within the estate itself, within the housing scheme itself, ideas spread, values spread on a network. It becomes more acceptable to become unemployed. And more generally, it's very well known from standard economics, the single most important way of getting off benefit is to find out that a job exists. And the single most important way of doing that is through personal contact. It's not through job centres, it's not through newspaper adverts, it's through, your uncle works in a warehouse, he tells you there's a vacancy coming up. So you go along, and implicitly you're already badged. You've always got some sort of sense vouching for you, and you're more likely to get it. These informal network contacts are very important. So on some estates, the culture of worklessness becomes strong, it spreads across the network, and the links to the outside world of work, finding out, become very weak. So in terms of thinking about policy here, we should be thinking, okay, benefits may have a role to play, but we should think, how can we change those networks? How can we actually connect them with people in work, the social networks? How can we do that? So they find out there are vacancies, so try and break down this idea of worklessness. Gives a different thing. We can change the shape of the network. We can penetrate the network, try and change the values. We can also try and change its structure by connecting them more with the outside world. Executive pay is currently a big issue. Well, the government can say what it wants, but there's undoubtedly a different set of values has emerged amongst executives in my lifetime. The last 30 or 40 years ago, it was not acceptable amongst, if you like, the executive class to receive, unless you worked in the city, vulgar amounts of money. You were well paid, but there was some sense of what seemed reasonable. Some sense that in some way your pay should be connected to your performance. And a set of values has grown up, which has altered that completely. And the way we have to change this is by changing values in that particular network. Now, incentives and legislation may have a role to play. So the government says it disapproves of it, tries to bring in some incentives. But just think about what happened in drink driving. Again, looking round, a few of us can indeed remember when it was brought in. And at first it was massively unpopular, the legislation, massively unpopular. And most people completely ignored it. I know because my uncle had a pub out on the moors above Bolton, and even the local police ignored it. They used to come and drink after hours and completely ignored the drink driving legislation. But gradually, a few people had changed their behaviour, and over time that spread. And it's now very effective that people now will chastise people and saying you mustn't have another drink, you're driving. And it's completely altered values. And the legislation was an incentive, a little seed. It's an incentive, if you like. If you get caught, you lose your licence. Most people ignored it because the chances of getting caught were virtually zero, unless you were involved in an accident. But gradually, over time, the values changed, and that actually proved very effective. So think about executive pay, or think about, in contrast, the speed limit is something which really hasn't been internalised, and people routinely break the speed limit, certainly on motorways, even though there's legislation. So the value there hasn't been internalised. So if we're dealing with executive pay, we have to think of a network thing again. Just briefly, environment. Okay, if we really want to make substantial reductions in energy which is consumed as a country, well, no democratic elected government can use incentives to do it, because the tax increases required to meet the targets the government's got is going to be so huge, any government's going to get voted out. Yeah, sure, you can stop people using petrol if it's £5 a litre, but how long are you going to stay in office? Not very long. You've got again to change people's incentives, to change their values. So successful policy making is very difficult. I'm very well aware of that. But the first step to better policy making seems to me to better understanding, and a key reason for many failures is a failure to recognise that it's networks and values which are a driving factor and not just incentives. They combine, and in many cases the networks become even more important. And the big society as a general concept seems to me to be based on the idea that it requires a change in values. It's a different way of thinking about policy. It's not just simply the classic one of agents reacting to incentives. It's getting people to change the values, whether it's in worklessness, whether it's in executive pay, whether it's the environment. It's a different and broader and potentially much more powerful way of thinking about policy. So to change values, I think we need networks, and we need an understanding of networks, and we're making some progress in getting there. So on that note, I'll bring it to an end and look forward to what the discussants have to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So as I said before, what we're going to do is just have two very quick sort of provocative reactions, just looking at Mike and Bridget, and then we're going to throw it open to you. So be ready, be thinking about how you want to challenge Paul or get him to solve your policy problem for you, free consultancy, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to turn straight away to Mike, who, as I said, not only is the author of System Stewardship, but also was one of the network of co-authors of Mindspace, which was the IFG Cabinet Office report last year on applying behavioural principles to policymaking. So, Mike.
Thanks, Jill. Speaking of Mindspace, I'm a bit of a nerd for behavioural economics, and one thing that I thought was quite interesting that came out of Paul's talk was perhaps a bit of a tension that isn't remarked on very often in behavioural economics, because on the one hand, you often hear about, we're predictably irrational, there are a series of biases that are quite consistent, very individually focused, and that was the critique of behavioural economics, quite individually focused. But at the same time, one of the big messages coming out from this whole way of thinking is that we're very influenced by our environment, by cues we encounter. We're actually quite malleable, or in a slightly sinister sense, or we're quite inconsistent from situation to situation. So in a sense, behavioural economics embraces the idea of networks in that sense, but at the same time, you've got this kind of other way of thinking, which is very much individually focused and around biases. And they're kind of two different intellectual traditions there, and we often conflate two, and that's why I think people often have a problem with behavioural economics. One thing I want to just say is, Paul's been talking about networks out there in the world, if you like, accomplishing particular policy goals. What about networks that implement policies in the first place? That's perhaps a really interesting thing when it comes to the big society. What we talk about in system stewardship is the idea that you have to understand the system you're dealing with if you're a policymaker in Whitehall, for example. So there's often been an intrinsic sort of understanding of policy of we come up with a plan and then people implement it in a very linear sort of way. Well, it's clear that we talked about central planners. That kind of model is becoming increasingly irrelevant, if you would believe the idea of the big society. But we question whether it was ever that true in the first place. If you look at a lot of implementation policy, you've got networks of people, each with their own goals and desires, each trying to achieve particular things. There may be instructions or guidance, but these often get adapted to particular contexts people are in, and that may be a good thing. It's often seen as a bad thing when it comes to policy, but it may be a good thing. I mean, this idea of policy implementation as a network, take the criminal justice system. We talk about in the report the fact that Schedule 21 of the Criminal Justice Act, David Blunkett had a particular policy. He wanted to get tough on a particular set of criminals. The problem is that the system strives for consistency. There was a ripple effect throughout the system around sentencing. It wasn't predictable. Maybe it was predictable, but it was not was intended by that specific policy. Yet the network of which we achieve public policy goals had a different effect. So the third point then is around the idea of adaptability. If, for example, messages or policy intentions do mutate through as they pass through networks and different people with different objectives, it suggests that adaptation is a key, trying to keep a sense of what is happening here. There's often the idea that policy is moving from a stable state to another stable state. But in fact, if you've got people adapting, reacting to new occurrences, to perhaps network effects, rather what you need is policymakers to have a much quicker feedback loop to get a sense of what is happening now, rather than waiting for an evaluation 5 years down the line. It's particularly true because we often think of policies as discrete artifacts, as particular projects. But in fact, out there, lots of policies are combining at the same time. They may have unexpected effects, as Paul's talking about. We need to know, as policymakers or as public sector workers, what's happening. And perhaps the structure of networks themselves change, which is a point we haven't thought about so much. We kind of thought network is almost a static thing at times. My final point is around experimentation. Because I think here is a uniting point between what Paul's talking about and behavioural economics. Because behavioural economics does try to be empirical. It does say we need to look at revealed behaviour. And the Behavioural Insights team in the Cabinet Office are big supporters of that. If we are exposed to many different influences when we make a decision, how do we know which one's going to have an impact at any particular time? We can't guarantee that a particular behaviourally informed policy will have the result we think. So we need to try and experiment at all times to work out what's having an effect and what isn't having an effect. Rather than sort of seeing, trying to influence people is a guaranteed thing, as Paul was saying, it's more of a stochastic thing. It's more to do with chance. In that case, if we put a series of experiments out there, we see which do and don't work, and we can start looking across them, start building up a more sophisticated understanding, and start building in networks, as Paul's talking about. That's potentially the future we could work towards.
Mike, thanks very much. Now, Bridget, what does this mean for Boris and London?
Indeed. Well, I suppose I want to talk about two things actually here. I first of all want to talk about how it feels to be a policymaker, what that's about, and also want to talk about, if you like, the victims on the other end of the policy process. And the starting point for that is really to think about, well, what are the networks which are managing or controlling the policy-making process itself? Now, I remember not so long ago, actually not in Boris's regime, but the previous one, sitting in a room where we were talking about the older people's strategy. And this discussion continued about what older people wanted and what the sort of policies were that we should be thinking about. And this is all terribly well-meaning. Everybody wanted to look after older people. And I sat there and I thought about, kept sort of listening to this stuff. And I looked around the room and the colour of the hair of the people in the room. And eventually I said, who are older people? And they said, it's sort of over 50. So I said, well, I'm 56, so this is for me, is it? And they went, oops. So there was a network failure, if you like, there, in terms of the self-referential nature of the group that had come together to discuss this and how they were thinking about the policy that they that they were trying to put together. And to be frank, I left the room and I think they just got on with it and did what they wanted to do anyway. This piece of grey hair really wasn't, she wasn't in the right box, really. So that question of how have you got involved in the policy process enough variety, enough diversity, is true in the policy-making process. It's also true generally in governance processes. After all, one of the sort of things about corporate governance that people have begun to think about is have you got access to all the sorts of knowledge and all the sorts of opinion that you might need to have if you're going to get some insights into whatever that process is. So I think that one of the first things that in policy we should be thinking about is the network that we're accessing a suitable one? The range of professions, the range of expertise, the outreach into the policy victims, and so on. Have we actually thought about whether we've missed anything, and whether we can realise that older people may not think of themselves as old once they hit 50. My birthday was yesterday as well, so this is particularly in my mind at the moment. So we think of the civil service, for example, particularly as being independent and not subject to pressures, and it guards that reputation quite carefully. But of course that means it's subject to all kinds of other pressures, other kinds of the views of people like us, and our ability to manage the networks which are out there. So that's the first point. Be very careful when you're thinking about a policy process or decision process, and be very careful in not being too arrogant, if you like, about your ability to know what's going on. So the uncertainty principle, I think, is one of the things that comes out of Paul's work. And therefore, as a result, the capacity for unintended consequences. And I suppose that brings us to the second bit, which is the people, we're making policy, we're making decisions, we're making them on behalf of people who are linked in other kinds of ways. One of the things I've certainly noticed is how easy it is to create a culture within an organisation or within a group of people, that kind of network, which can quite easily survive, and civil service is an example of this actually, but so are corporates. You can take off the top team, you can recruit a completely different set of executives or managers or politicians who are running it, and the system will go on doing exactly the same thing as it did before. So the culture of how we do things round here is precisely a network phenomenon, and is actually extremely difficult in many cases to disrupt. Maybe much stronger than any decision-making process that you've got. And that can be true in small networks, and it can be true, it's almost in the kind of the genes of buildings, I sometimes think. So managing a network or disrupting it may be a question of, you may be able to find those 2 or 3 key people who are the people who sit round the water cooler in the American idiom, and who are the people who control this. But I have to say that I've looked at many of the organisations that you can look at. It's not at all obvious that those people exist. It's much more distributed than that. There isn't sort of one person at the centre of a spider web, and if only you could, the person who takes the tea round, if only you could find them, it would all be okay. But that also says, so that's, I think, again, says something about the uncertainty, the difficulty, the stability, if you like, which is built into systems, and therefore that success may be a slow thing, a slow burn that you have to look for, not to look for big things. That's a great difficulty in any policy-making process, where you're always looking for the quick wins and the immediate targets. And the final thing that I want to say in that sort of context brings in another economic concept, if you like, which is the concept of agglomeration. One of the things that I think that the whole thing about infrastructure and infrastructure arguments, which is one of the things that I've been in policy context, I suppose, spent more of my time with Boris and before him with Ken arguing about, is the need for infrastructure. And infrastructure is the process by which you can create successful networks and create the agglomeration of activities, which means that people can get together and be productive, have ideas. You may not always like the ideas, but nonetheless, without the kind of feed of new stuff happening, you either grow or you die. So I think that for me, the final sort of the big block, if you like, in this network sense is also the thinking about the physical networks and the physical ways in which we can bring people together, and I don't want to forget that part of it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Hopefully, yes. Fantastic telepathic communication with the next room. Microphones emerge, and I'm going to throw it up, open for questions, comments. I think the sort of key thing is this a help? Is it a hindrance? How do we actually get a grip on networks? Which network? I've had similar reactions on the stuff DWP has put out on alleged older people, and you wonder whether they ever showed it to their permanent secretary. I refer to the Full of Life website, which is a particularly dire offering from DWP to people over 50, aka not dead yet quite, but anyway. I think it's really interesting things, but have you got the right network where networks collide, et cetera, and are we all actually victims of our own networks? I think Mike's example of the judges' network, basically remaking sentencing policy in a way not intended by ministers, is actually quite an interesting example of transmission networks, even if they're not which is now brought to us the final policy victims. I think there's a different approach to talking about citizen-centred or policy making. So who's going to kick off? The inevitable network effects. No one asked a question at the start, and you'll all want to be asking questions by 7:30. So here's the thing. Excellent. Yeah, no, down here, and then let's take a couple and kick it around. Yes, and could you say who you are?
Okay.
Where you're from?
I'm Helen Smart, and I'm a civil servant and a policymaker, hopefully. What I'm interested in is we're talking about things trending through networks, but there's always a starting point, and there is a theory that there are trend makers, that there are people that kick things off. And I'm interested in how that links in to the theory of the network once the momentum's going, really, and whether, as you say, we need to find those people, those groups of people, to have any ability to change ideas and movements within networks.
Okay, excellent question. And here, and then we'll come to the front. Yes.
I wanted just to basically make a brief comment on experimentation. I'm unsure if you've heard of the fun theory. The fun theory. F-U-N theory. It was basically, so it's something run by Volkswagen to try and influence social change through making things fun. For instance, they converted some stairs into a piano to encourage people to use the stairs, and they attached some basic electronic device to a bin to make people throw the rubbish out, etc. So basically my point is, do you think making things fun to do might help in terms of policy implementation, certainly towards influencing networks? And also, when thinking about networks, it's not just about the behavioural influences of the most popular, but actually why those choices were made in the first place. And it's usually because the stories are quite shocking and evoking extreme emotion. I'm sure when you looked at the crocodile, you thought, wow, this is a massive crocodile, and that kind of extreme emotion caused you to click on it, not just because it was necessarily in the most popular list.
Okay, and yes, in front.
Eve Middleton-Kelly, London School of Economics. There are 2 points I want to make. One is that networks are not of the same configuration. There are many different configurations of network. So, for example, when Bridget said that you can only disrupt a network if you can identify the key people, you can if it's, for example, a hub and spoke network, but you cannot in a distributed network. So I think very much depends on the configuration of the network. And therefore we need to understand also that configuration. The other is the idea of values and adaptation to the value. And I think that Paul almost went towards what I'm about to say, but didn't quite name it. It is not just adaptation, because when you adapt your values, you are influencing others. They may change their behavior, and that change in behavior comes back and affects you. In other words, that's co-evolutionary dynamics. They are very powerful, and again, we need to understand those co-evolutionary dynamics if we're going to try to do anything about policy. If we don't understand co-evolutionary dynamics, policy becomes meaningless.
Paul, do you want to
Well,
pick up?
yes, I'd like to comment first of all, and will making things fun make people more likely to adopt them? Well, as a Lancastrian, no chance. But I think there's an important point here because, so think for example, not your particular example, say viral marketing, which has become very popular, and some aspects become fantastic and successful. Most viral marketing campaigns, like the charter, the social influence there, completely fail, get absolutely nowhere. But what's important from this is even people who've run successful viral marketing campaigns find it very hard to replicate them because of the role of chance and contingency. So the songs which you're thinking about popular cultural networks, especially web-based ones, the songs the songs which emerge were ones which got an initial, perhaps a random lead. Just a few people happened to download it, then people saw it was number one. So these things are very hard often to replicate. So if Volkswagen have had success, in a sense it makes policy in a sense more difficult. If I can just come more general idea of evaluation and evidence-based policy, it makes it much harder to evaluate because supposing we try a policy, a few people take it up, and then it actually hits the right part of the network, and the people who take it up are connected to people who are easily persuadable, and it spreads. We think that policy has been fantastically successful. The same policy in a different country could have hit a different part of the network, where it persuades a few people, but they're connected to people who are very hard to persuade, and it just dies away. So it makes it harder to evaluate, even ex post, things which are likely to succeed. But having said that, I think the idea of, and it picks up something that Michael was saying, the idea of experimentation is certainly something I think which intuitively the private sector has sort of lived with for a long time. So you have to be much more willing to experiment, you get feedback, you cut things off if it's not working, but you also have to embrace the concept, I understand why this is much more difficult for the public sector, because public money is involved. To embrace the idea of failure, that a lot of things will fail by their very nature, and the key thing is to cut them off quite quickly. On the question of trend makers, well, I mean, Eve partly mentioned this, and I did mention there are different types of network. Now, Malcolm Gladwell's book on Tipping Point, which many of you may have read, is a very valuable book. He spread the ideas of networks, but he only really talks about a particular type. And I didn't show that in the graphics there, but it's one where, and it's one which is often encountered, especially more, if you like, ideological or belief networks, where there are a small number of individuals with very large numbers of connections. And if you can target those, it's actually, they will be then the change makers. Actually, there's also one of the first examples, empirical examples of network analysis, I think was in Physics Journal in 1996, on looking at the nature of sexual contacts, when there were a few people with hundreds of contacts, and most people not very many. So if you wanted to stop the spread of sexual disease, in a sense you have to target these hubs if the network looks like that. And if you miss one of them, it doesn't matter what you do, the rest of it's going to come back. But so that, yes, if that's the case, if you can identify them, and there are subtle variants of this connected with the people around it and this sort of thing. There's lots of mathematical theory on this in the last 10, 15 years. The one I showed there was a different structure. I mean, if I could, just for a minute, without, I mean, I should have the disadvantage of, so if it's like this, a small world network, okay, well, who's the influential person there? Well, I don't know, maybe these long-range connectors have got more of a chance, but it's not as obvious. Most people have got relatively small number of connections, and it's harder to penetrate. Other networks are of different kinds. So there's also work which enables us to actually try to get an approximation to the type of network which will guide policy. That's what I start hinting at when I talk about network, understanding network structure is important. So if you do have a network like you're describing and you can find the key people, yes, then it gives policy a huge potential boost. You just need to change their behaviour, and the chances are, it won't be guaranteed, that it will spread. So understanding network structure and the ways in which it will actually may influence the spread, I think is very important. There's a very large mathematical literature on this with many, many more empirical examples, mainly driven by people not from economics, say physicists or even anthropologists or sociologists. There's a vast literature on this now.
But Bridget, I mean, there are very few physicists, sociologists or whatever working in government, so how does government sort of get a grip on the type of networks it's dealing with?
Well, I think that it's about thinking about the concepts rather than necessarily trying to go out there and measure all of these things. So it's understanding the differences between different kinds of networks. But I think that you've made a point that we need to, or not just to understand the network, but also understand how it's evolving as well. And that means that the moment you've measured it, it's going to be out of date. So the idea that we can map this stuff, I mean, you think about the 1950s firm, there probably was the person in the middle, she was the managing director's secretary actually. She ran the business, knew everybody, was in control of everybody. So that was the hub at the middle of the business. But unfortunately, we haven't got many of those anymore. The thing is much more fluid. But if you think, therefore, that what you've got to do is map it, find out what it is, and then you'd be able to manage it, that's just not. It's going to move faster than we can do that. So there's the control problem, actually, I think becomes quite acute. So you could put all the sort of physicists trying to map it, the policy process, that won't actually help you. What that actually suggests to me is that it comes back to the experimentation point. It comes back to the test and try, get out there, see if it works. Does it seem to be what people want? Does it take you in the direction that the politicians and the people who are elected to do this want to go? If so, stick with it. If not, stop. That's very difficult.
Microphone.
Fun. So, yeah, I actually have a different way of thinking about that. It's in terms of salience. What draws your attention? We talk about this in Mindspace, actually. And the example we give is in Southwark, where they had to notify people, statutory obligation to notify people about litter fines that came in. And they did this by dressing up as giant litter and walking around the streets going, hey, there are some new fines coming in. Of course, if you'd just been going around with leaflets, no one would have noticed. But as someone said, if you dress as a giant banana, you get 10 seconds of attention. The issue is, and with the fun theory stuff, is that 6 months down the line, right, are people still doing the piano stairs, or are they just like stomping down them? Are people still going, oh, piano stairs, or it's like, oh, it's the giant banana again, great, and he's, with the chewing gum, I know where this is going. Is it still salient? And it may be that there's a bit of a short half-life for that kind of intervention. It's about attention, I think.
Government's a never-ending source of fun. Let's have some more. Yes, back there.
I had to come in then, didn't I? I'm a civil servant. My name is Ruth Marshall from the Department for Communities and Local Government. Our department spends a great deal of time trying to influence local authorities. And in a position where our traditional levers, throwing money at them or regulating to death, are no longer particularly relevant, I'm curious as to your ideas and indeed those of the audience as the best ways to influence local authority networks.
Okay, let's go just the other side of the camera.
I'm John Geaver. I used to be a policymaker. I think this is very valuable, this stuff about networks, particularly for economists. Other people knew about this, but it's a very big advance in economists, and economists dominate a lot of policy making now, so it's very important that they get hold of this. And experiments too, although my experience was experiments always work, but they're always disappointing when you roll them out, so you've got a sort of positive bias in experiment in policy. I thought that, in my experience, you've got a particular wish in the big society, which is not about changing values, but it's about shifting the network balance so that existing values and existing wishes in a group are more prominent and create a social pressure for other people to fall into line. That's what you're trying to do on antisocial behavior, on work, on crime, on litter. You're not actually having to convince people that it's a bad thing to litter, or it'd be a good thing to volunteer, or that antisocial behavior is a bad idea. It's about shifting the balance within particular networks so that existing values given more prominence. And I wondered if you thought that was right.
Okay, and let's just take one last question. Is there anyone else lurking near the back? Midway. Wait for the microphone. And tell us who you are.
Robert Robertson. I live in Edinburgh. I have worked for local authorities. And I think the thing about local authorities is you give them the means to pay for it by making the rating system work properly. I'm a rating surveyor by training. And you allow them to get on with it. And you shouldn't seek to influence them too much.
Okay, well, I think it's quite an interesting set of questions here about what actually is the role of government in this sort of decentralised thing, of sort of leveraging local authority networks, things like that, changing social value. Is this really a thing that governments can do? It's almost that question, is can government actually start off the trend and actually be the impetus behind it? What does it mean for working?
Well, I think John's right. I mean, we're not talking about creating new values, but you're right. I mean, at any point across the population as a whole, there'll be different sets of values, and it's about trying to get certain kinds to spread more than they are at present. That's what the big society is about. It's not creating a new set of values. It's encouraging the percolation of an existing set in different contexts. That's absolutely right. I think going back to a comment that Bridget made, I want to comment on that, saying it's not appropriate to try and get a map of a network, and I would agree with that. I mean, it's too difficult. It's not a question it evolves. Even with ICT, which there's a lot of potential. Think about, say, mobile phone networks. We have a lot more information on how people move around, who they communicate with. There's lots of interesting papers on this in terms of the use of ICT to actually tap into previously information on networks which previously didn't exist. But it evolves. I agree with that. But say one area where it might be useful to try and get a complete map, and I think the Bank of England are interested in this, is a map of who the banks are connected to and what their exposures are, including their off-balance sheets. So that might be a sort of a complete map which is worth trying to get and might be possible, because if you're judging whether to let a financial institution fail, and let's just hypothesize, and it's connected principally to other institutions who are financially sound, then you say, okay, down the road you go. But if they're connected to those who may follow in a domino effect, then you've got to intervene. So trying to get more information there, which exists, I think will be a very good thing. Trying to think of policy rather than having a set of fixed regulations, making it partly dependent, the response, on the network structure of the institution, which in principle could be gained. In social networks, it's much harder. And I agree. And what we're trying to do, going back to a previous question, is to try to approximate the structure and say, in this particular case, does it look like this? Does it look like I can't remember the phrase you used, but one with a few key people? There are a few, if you like, types which appear to exist in social and economic systems. Local authorities, well, that's an example of how culture has changed. Let me reveal my bias a minute. There was a time when people in local authorities were doing it to serve the community rather than inflict a set of values on us. So I think a key thing is how you get those values to change. And I think the government doesn't realise, well, some ministers do, that its principal task in confronting the state is not the level of expenditure, but it's a cultural issue. They're engaged in a culture war rather than a war simply, or a struggle rather, about levels of expenditure. And that seems to be a much more dividing line between the ways in which certain parts of the public sector behave and the way the government want them to behave, rather than necessarily the levels of expenditure that they receive. The government have to understand the role of culture and how it spreads across networks in tackling this problem.
Bridget.
I think the question about local authorities is extremely interesting, because from the perspective of actually a unique local authority, the GLA, what it feels like is that is a very top-down perspective. So here it is the government wanting to tell local authorities or influence local authorities what to do, Whereas what we want to be able to do is have the, I think it's what you said, have the right and responsibility to be grown-ups, to be adults, and to make our own choices for that local community, even if that is not necessarily what central government is particularly after at that moment. That may still be the right thing to do. And I suppose that actually is also part of the whole policy conundrum, isn't it? Because we all talk as if somehow there is a right answer out there. And yet I think everything that in this discussion, and indeed everything about the sort of perspectives, different perspectives that people have, tell you that if there is a right answer, probably we've got as many right answers in this room as there are people, if not more, because we've got economists in the room after all, and they notoriously don't agree. So that perspective, the problem of what direction you're seeing it from actually means you may see the network itself differently, but also your capacity to be influenced by somebody that you're connected to, or an organisation that you're connected to, is also going to be different. So the point I just want to end on, which I think we keep losing, is Paul talked about it, but I think that it's the hardest bit to think about. It's not just about the shape of the network, it is also about your propensity to take an influence within that network. So there may be these sort of patterns of connection, but if Paul comes to me and says, I think it'd be a good idea if you do that, I might tell him to go and do the other thing, and certainly not. He's not influencing me. Heaven forfend.
Mike, I think there is a tension, which isn't often noted, I think, in the big society between values and behaviour, I think, and it varies according to which government minister is talking about it sometimes. I think sometimes it's talked of in terms of simply a behaviour, like it's very easy, you can just do this particular thing, and then this would be focusing on networks. It's about connecting people who already think a certain thing, have certain values. Yet if you hear other people talk about it, it's very much a values conversation. It's about trying to almost engender a spirit of doing something differently, believing in different things, of thinking that civic mindedness is important, that we want to encourage in Britain. And these are actually very different ways of thinking about it. There's a purely behaviourist language and there's sort of values language, and they can actually be entirely separate.
Actually, I was going to ask John a question, which might be a bit evil, because John is a former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, about whether if the Bank of England and the FSA had thought about banks in a more networked way, they would have regulated them differently.
I don't think so. I mean, the idea that economists all disagree is a bit of a conceit among economists. Actually, the problem is that they mainly think just alike, and we thought just alike, and therefore we overlooked certain problems. Actually, we had in the bank a very active group trying to apply network theory to banks as we went over the cliff, and afterwards it's been quite useful in explaining what was happening.
Okay, let's go back. Sorry about that. It was just a sort of personal timeout. I just thought we'd take the advantage of John being here. Some more questions. Yes, we've got back there and then coming forward.
Christopher Foster. I've been a microeconomist all my life. I confess to not having read The Death of Economics, or indeed your other two books, Paul. I'm in a very lonely voice, I suspect. I'm deeply sceptical, at least to some, of what you're saying. Indeed, pursuit to a lot of conclusion, it sounds like anarchism, and an inability, really, to take decisions that last or to build policies that are permanently constructive. It seems to me one needs to draw a very firm distinction between the descriptive or predictive on the one side and the evaluative or normative. I'm absolutely straight. I'm sure it's totally true that one needs to take into account the fact of networks and their consequences when considering options, considering the nature of the problem you're trying to deal with, and indeed in that context. But equally well, it seems to me that when one tries to work out what one's going to do, what choice one's going to make, it is very important that whatever the evidence is, where it's evidence about networks or evidence about not networks, and indeed there are many, many branches of political life, like energy and I would say transport to a large extent, a huge number, where networks are relatively unimportant, and you can actually go ahead and make rational decisions without thinking too deeply about networks. I don't mind being proved wrong in any given instance, but I think one can usually get the structure of decision-making fairly clear without that. But I think there is, these things are important. And I can remember years ago being involved in the decision the government made about whether safety policy should concentrate on seatbelts or whatever. Made about 25 suggestions, and we worked out the 3 which seemed to us most important. I think time has actually proved that to be correct. So what worries me here, and I will stop, is that I think unless you have a very clear and narrative notion of what the costs and benefits are of the policy of pursuing, which are compared to modify cost in the light of experience and evidence, you will never get to a situation where you have rational policy making. You will, as has been suggested here, go from one bright idea or slightly chaotic and failed idea to another.
Okay, that's a good challenge. I actually meant the person next to you, though, Christopher, so do you have a question? No? Okay, that was... I couldn't see the hands there, so let's come forward. Yes, there.
Thanks. My name is Ben Toombs. I work for TNS BMRB, the social research company. Mike mentioned litter earlier, and that just reminded me of a sign I saw on the M6 a couple of months ago, which said, bin your litter, other people do, which seemed to me like a very sort of crude top-down attempt at social norming. It probably has some effect, but I don't know how effective it is. But I just, that doesn't seem like a network example of a network effect at all. But it did actually seem quite close to what Paul was talking about with the example of downloading and following trending topics on Twitter. In a sense, that seems closer to the social norming message than it does to a network effect like on the board there. I just wonder how important the personal connection between people through a message.
Very interesting, and I think... Yes.
I'm Robert Morland. I think after the point that 50 is old, I better say I'm a very elderly person.
Me too.
But I'm a former member of 2 EU institutions. My point is quite simple, and oddly enough follows from the last one. I noticed the phrase top-down has been used quite a number of times this evening. I don't know if I've heard the word bottom-up in the context of networking. Is it irrelevant?
Okay, well, so a challenge to you all from Christopher, who basically just says this is a recipe for doing nothing and whatever. And
well, let me respond to that by saying I think all existing microeconomic theory is simply a special case of the more general theory which is covered by networks, because this model here, as I pointed out, reduces to the isolated agent. If we take out the links, have no network, we can say this is microeconomic theory. That's how agents behave according to micro theory. But in many circumstances in the 21st century world, they will also not evaluate products in a so-called rational way, not evaluate choices, but for a variety of psychological reasons will copy. So network effects give a more general theory than existing microeconomics. It's simply reducible to a special case. It's not a recipe for anarchy, as I said. It helps us understand why it's often very hard to decide successful policies, why it's very hard to understand the evidence. It gives us a new dimension, a new perspective. It helps us realize why many things have failed. We haven't taken account of different dimensions. It makes it difficult, it makes it understanding why it's hard to interpret evidence, but also, as I say, it gives potentially more powers. If we can get some understanding, it gives more powerless. Can I just spend a couple of minutes giving a specific example?
Yep.
I wrote a paper a few years ago with a medieval historian who specialised in the Cathar heresy, which was the first major heresy to face the Catholic Church for about 1,000 years. And they set up the Inquisition to deal with it. And the Dominicans were scientists, and they codified it. It took about a century to eliminate it. Essentially, they didn't add the maths, but they used network theory. First of all, they started off, remember the Albigensians and the phrase, "My Lord Bishop, how will we know the true faith? Kill them all, the Lord will know his own." So they tried a policy of random inoculation, because the Cathar faith was based on a few, going back to your example, perfecti, leaders who went around and people had great reverence for them, and that was how the faith spread. And so they tried slaughtering a town, but if they didn't get the perfected, it kept popping back. And they tried different sorts of strategies, and finally they worked out, and this was proved only in 2005 in the mathematics of network, that around medieval Europe at the time, there were people called guides who made a living by going from village to village and passing on the news. And so they'd go around and say, next village, this Cathar leader was speaking. And so basically they gathered in the guides, and they weren't interested in what they believed. They didn't ask them any questions about belief. They said, if you go around and mention these Cathars, we'll burn you to death. And that actually stopped. It eliminated a heresy very rapidly. So it was inoculation of not the hubs, because he couldn't catch them all, but the rounds out. So very effective. It's a good example, and it's often been followed in modern counter-terrorism strategies of use of a concept of a network, its general structure, and how you actually do something about it. So I think it does give a lot more power to policy.
So is it just a fancy name for social norms on this point?
Well, I mean, you could. I mean, how do social norms? Why do they exist? They're a set of values held across a network of agents. But it gives a way of actually formalises a way of helping to think about how they arise, how they disappear, how we might be able to influence the spread. I mean, it's actually it's not just in a fancy way. It actually formalises it and gives us tools to think about it. It doesn't mean we get a complete understanding, but it's a way of thinking about how values spread, how they're contained, how they might alter. And certainly, I mean, a message that other people do things seems to be quite important. I mean, it might be counterproductive. You might be able to say, well, there'll always be individuals like that. But I believe, that one of the psychological, strong psychological reasons behind copying is desire to imitate, to follow social norms, to follow the behaviour of the majority. Not always the case. There are innovators. But you could think of it as a fancy way, but it's quite a powerful analytical way.
But that's clearly an example of a sort of top-down one where some policymaker has chosen to put up a sign. They've read Mindspace, they put up the sign not saying 98, don't litter or whatever, or lots of people litter, that's, whatever. There's classic.
Just come back to this question of bottom up. I think one of the key things about networks, it is micro-based. A lot of it is bottom up. It's about ideas. I mean, people are constantly, there's a constant flow of new ideas, new behaviours in society all the time. And most of them don't go very far. Some then take off, and if they become sufficiently embedded, they become social norms. And so what we have in network systems are very strongly emergent properties. They emerge from the bottom up. We can try and influence it from the top and go backwards and forwards, like Eve was suggesting. But the whole idea of a network society is that it is very much based on the individual and on emergent phenomenon, coming bottom up rather than being dictated to top down.
So, Mike, what's your answer to Chris?
Well, I wonder if we're talking about slightly different things here, because, of course, one very effective way of changing people's behaviour is to pass a law forbidding them to do it. And that can still be done. I mean, that will generally work across networks unless you have a criminal network, which is fine with not obeying the law. So I think what we're focusing mainly on is perhaps some more difficult policy aims, which you can't legislate for so much or coerce people into doing, that cannot, because of course none of this is inimical with power hierarchy. You could still do these kind of things, but if government is trying to get in the space where it's trying to deal with obesity or crime or more complex social phenomena who may be transmitted through networks, that kind of approach probably isn't going to work. There's a very simple answer to it, and it's probably not enough, but we are talking about slightly different things, I think. And what I took from Ben's question was quite interesting. So a whole different topic is, how do we feel about government saying things like it's a friend or a person to us. You talked about the importance of personal relations. You know, I think there's a really interesting question here about how far, if government gets more cued into how we react to things and knows what influences us, where do we draw the line in terms of an impersonal state versus a state which can know us and which speak to us like another person? That's an open question.
Bridget.
Okay, well, I'd like to challenge the idea that networks are unimportant in energy or transport, as Kit suggested, because I think that they are key elements in the energy system, and how we distribute energy and the network that makes that possible is one important element in energy policy. And in transport policy, transport is a network. That's what it is. It makes it possible for people, goods and so on to move around and to connect with one another. It's not a social network, it's a physical network. And it leads to the ideas around agglomeration, which I mentioned at the end of my first remarks, which is about how a transport system makes it possible for connections to be made, productivity to increase, and an economy to become more successful. I don't think that's irrational, but I do think we need to take some of these effects in. So if we're thinking about how we think about costs and how we think about benefits, if we're leaving pieces of that out because we're not thinking about that connectivity and that network effect, then we will be missing something important, and our policy will actually be irrational.
Okay, let's just take a couple more questions, and then I'm just going to warn the panel that I think just to sort of leave on a concrete note, it would be really interesting if each of you come up with an area where you actually think that a policy could have been, if only they'd thought about networks, that policy could have been better, or whatever. So it's a real practical example, just very quick fire on the panel. So just take another couple. We've got one at the back and one here, and that's then Schluss. Yeah.
Hi, Hugh Lloyd, the Office for Public Management. Paul, how would you feel about me substituting the word community for the word network?
Okay, it's a very quick question, very good.
Mine's not so quick, and it's possibly a statement. Lawrence Bloom, I'm fascinated by networks, and it's been a really enlightening and interesting evening. It seems to me that one of the most successful recent networks has been the Tea Party in America, where there's been a significant impulse from a small group of people to fund a group that would act indeed in the way that the Tea Party are acting, and I wonder if the panel have any comments on that.
Okay, well, let's, Paul, I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh, well, I see. So, okay, fine.
Yeah, you're going to get the last word. So,
right.
Bridget.
So I'm answering the questions and coming up with the concrete.
And then if you can think of a concrete example.
Right, just checking what
the
question is. It's rather thrown me. I think that
You don't have to do it. I mean, disobey my norming.
I think in terms of this community, you can replay, if that is a better from your perspective, something that makes sense to you in terms of a network, but there are many other forms that networks take as well as communities. So that is, I think, a subset. And not all communities connect in the same kind of way either. So and some communities are physically in existence. Some of them are maybe very spread out. There's communities, professional communities. So I think network is actually a more precise word and a more general word for what we ought to be talking about. And then, so in terms then of what this actually does, what policy could we have done better, then actually for me it is not just the social policies, if you like, although that's possibly the case, but actually I think if we had thought earlier about some of the network effects in our physical networks, we would not be so underinvested in some of our transport networks as actually we are.
Okay, Mike.
Community network, I mean, I suppose there is a big thing about language here, which comes back to Eve's question at the start. We use the word system, we use the word network, we mean lots of different things. And indeed, you know, words matter. I think that there are a whole different set of connotations to do with community, which perhaps don't fit in with the kind of way we speak about networks in a very sort of dry and abstract scientific way. That might be one reason it's not used. Maybe others, but that seems the most obvious reason why we settle on network. In terms of policy, it's not a policy out there trying to influence people, it's one about how government behaves, or indeed how the public sector behaves. Spread of good clinical practice through the NHS. Guidance, I mean, you've got a community there where guidance is unlikely to have much effect, written guidance from management. Rather, there's evidence that spread innovations or good clinical practice through the NHS through clinicians associating with each other, what they call homophily, so you tend to associate with people who are like you. There could have been ways of using networks, social networks that exist in the NHS to try and drive through better practice much more effectively than has been done in the past. And I think that is changing now. And you know, the Darzi review looked a lot of this about spreading innovation, but that's somewhere a lot of time got lost, I think.
Okay, so Paul, you've got to answer the question about the Tea Party.
Well,
as about community.
I agree. I mean, words are very important, and even networks, you know, mean different things to different people. For many people, they say they simply mean online networks when it's much more general than that. So finding the right word, finding the right phrase is actually quite important. I think, you know, over time, economists have actually been very good at that by saying, you know, they have rational agents. So how could possibly anybody be irrational? But I think actually economic rationality is only one possible definition. And in the network world, it's like in the country of the blind, the rational agent actually becomes irrational, but that's a different point altogether. We could have a different talk about that completely. So, you know, language is important. The Tea Party, well, yes, I mean, it doesn't mean it'll succeed, but the small groups, we know that small groups with particular views, particular values, have the capacity to, if they can actually hit the right note, access the right part of the network, have a bit of a major ability to influence behaviour, to change behaviour. It's always hard to know ex ante whether it's going to succeed, but certainly we can see many examples in history. I think, in fact, you know, I'm actually very interested in, you know, rewriting history from a network perspective. Most of, you know, I mean, it shows the inherent uncertainties, the difficulty of ex post evaluation. Most of history is about changing values, how ideas spread, how behaviour spreads. So that's a different project. I think I mean, there are many examples I could give where I think networks would have made a difference to policy. But let me finish just by disagreeing for once with John and saying I do think that governments and international bodies would have behaved differently if they had been aware of the potential systemic risk that the financial sector faced. As you know very well, we were driven by a man who believed in central planning. He thought by writing enough, not you, but you know, we all know what I'm talking about, you know, who thought by writing enough rules and regulations you could act as a central planner and eliminate risk and uncertainty. And that was the, if you like, the driving ideology, the value which had spread across governments, across central banks, across international regulators, to believe that you could actually anticipate any possible outcome. They didn't take account of the fact that when one went down, the rest might go. They didn't take account of the fact of a credit crunch, that if people lost confidence in the ability of institutions to repay each other, no lending would take place whatsoever. That was the initial sign of the crisis in 2007. So I believe if people had a network perspective and realised the systemic risk to spread across a network of unwillingness to lend because of lack of confidence, lack of knowledge on the off-balance sheet liabilities, if they'd known about the potential for bankruptcy to spread across financial institutions, I believe that policy in the 2000s would have been completely different if regulators and policymakers had understood that, had a much better understanding of it than they did.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all very much to our panellists for putting on a very excellent evening. Very good discussion, very lovely. Thank you all very much to you. So just thank the panellists.